So this section of the course is optional for those who already know about ES6 or otherwise the ES 2015 release of JavaScript. So if you do know that, then feel free to skip this section. Otherwise, in this section, we're basically going to be covering what the ES 2015 features are, such as let, const, arrow functions, and a whole bunch of other stuff. And the reason why we're going to be covering this is because React is built with a lot of these next generation features. And so because JavaScript is an evolving language, we need to keep up to date with the way that the syntax works. And so it's important for us as developers to be up to date. And also ES 2015 makes our code a lot cleaner and just a lot nicer to work with. So hence, I believe it's quite important, and so we'll be covering a lot of these features in the videos of this section. This page that I'm on right now is Babel, and Babel is basically a compiler for older JavaScript and newer JavaScript. So the reason why it was created was because the browsers were slightly behind in the development of JavaScript as a language, and so Babel was created to transpile the code that was written using ES 2015 syntax to be converted back into slightly older syntax so that the browser could understand it. Even though the browsers are slightly behind, they are catching up, and so it still is important for us to learn the latest syntax. And as we go into the future, this syntax will become more best practice, and the browsers will hence be using it more frequently. So Babel is just something interesting to look at. Here on their documentation page, you can take a look at all of the ES 2015 features. And so let's jump into the section and get started. So the first next-gen JavaScript feature that we're going to be looking at is the declaration of let and const. And so before ES6, we used to declare variables with the var key. So we would say variable, and then we would say something like person equals to some kind of object. And this would declare that variable. So we could never actually just say person equals to something. We would have to declare it as a variable. And so now in ES6, let and const essentially replace the need for using variable. And so it's quite convenient because we would use let if we wanted to make the object something that we could change, and we would use const if we wanted it to be an object that we can't change. So for example, we could make this person, we could let person be an object, and then later on we would edit the object by saying person.name equals to Matt. And that would be perfectly fine because we've declared person as an object that we can change. If this was a constant, then we wouldn't be allowed to actually edit this object in any way. So maybe for a better example, we would declare some kind of constant as maybe API key. And that would be equal to some kind of string. And you would definitely want this to be a constant because if the API key was wrong, then it wouldn't work. So this is quite convenient because it allows us to keep track of some of the objects that we know we want to keep constant and some of the objects that we know we actually want to change. The second next generation feature we're looking at is the ES6 arrow function. And so initially before ES6, we used to declare a function by saying function and then give it a name, for example, call me. And call me would take in some parameter, which we would say, for example, name, and then it would perform some kind of function such as logging it in the console to be basic. And this is what it was before ES6, but now we can remove the actual need for calling function and actually just say it's a constant, give it a name, and then using an arrow function syntax, which is saying the call me constant is equal to, and then this declaration here of the empty parentheses and then the arrow sign equal to some kind of callback is the same thing as declaring a function with a name and then putting its parameter inside there. So if we wanted to put the parameter inside these brackets here, then we would put name over there, and then again we would just log out whatever we wanted to do. And something that's quite convenient about these ES6 arrow functions is that when you only have one parameter, you don't need the parentheses. So we can actually shorten it to be exactly just looking like this. And that is quite clean. So that is just one of the things. If there is more than one feature, or more than one parameter rather, then you would need to have parentheses. So for example, name and surname, then you would need to call these parameters inside the parentheses. If there's only one, then you can remove the parentheses. And so that is quite nice. Another thing is that with the arrow functions, we can then call these functions in one single line. So if there's no return of the function, then we can do that. As soon as we are returning something, so for example, here we would return this, or we could just say return name. So here, because we are returning, we need to spread this over multiple lines. However, if this was to be done in one line, we could just say call me equals to something being passed in, and then just say give us name, just like that. So now it's being done in one line, and this is actually the same thing as this. So as soon as you need the return key, then by placing it here, we would need to place this inside the brackets. So like that. And now it would be okay. The next thing we're going to look at is the new syntax for imports and exports. So here I've got this playground.js file, and I'm going to work out of that and app.js just to give an example. So here there are two types of exports that were introduced. So the first is the default export. So here, for example, we could create some kind of constant function. So we'll just say give me name, and it takes in name and it returns name. And then to export it, we would say export default give me name. So this syntax of exporting give me name as the default export means that in another file you can import this function actually with any name. And the reason is because it is being specified as the default export, it means that whatever's being imported from this file is deemed to be this function. So the name actually doesn't matter. So for example, in here we could say import give me another name like that and say from playground, and that would be perfectly fine. There's no problems with doing that. But now if we were to use the other syntax, which is the named exports, so for example we could say constant another function, and we'll say it takes in some name as well and it returns name, then this another function, if we were to export it saying export constant another function, so like that, or another way of doing that is to take the export and just put that ahead of the function like that. That means that this function here, because we're exporting it, we're calling export before the name of the function, this is called a named export. And that means that inside app.js, if we wanted to import this function, we would need to import it inside curly braces, the same way that we are importing the component from React. So here we would have to say inside these curly braces, then import another function. And this time the name actually matters. So here you would have to call the name of the function because it's a named export. Whereas with the default export, that is the default function or the default constant being exported from that file. So the name can actually be whatever you want it to be. So now what we're going to look at are classes. And so a class is basically a feature that replaces the need for constructor functions and prototypes. So to illustrate what that means, let's say, for example, we had a class of person. And this is basically just a way of structuring our code into an object or a way of containing that code. And so the old way of doing that used to be defining a constructor method on that class. And that is basically like initiating this instance of the class. And we could say something like this.name equals to dude. And so what that would do is every time you have a person and you wanted to access the name of that person, it would have the name dude by default because it's being defined in the constructor of that class. So for example, if we wanted to create a person, we would say that constant person equals to a person, and we would say a new person, so it's a new object of that class. And if we wanted to access the name property of that class, we would just say console.log person.name, and then that would give us dude. So that's what would be printed out if we were to actually run this. But now, this is the old way of doing that. The new way of doing that is a lot quicker, and it actually just removes the need for the constructor class, so or the constructor method. So what would actually, how we actually do this in ES6 is we would just say class person and then just define name equal to dude. So you don't need to call this and you don't need to call constructor. And that is the new ES6 way of defining a class. And we could do this exact same thing here. We could create a new instance of that person. And then if we wanted to get the name, then it would also be dude in this case. So I'm just going to note here that this is the old way and this is the new way. And so something that we can also do is we can define methods on a class. So for example, let's say we wanted a method on the person class that would get the person's name or print the person's name. So we could say print name, and that would just be a method on the class. So you define it like this in this kind of syntax. And we could just say console.log this.name. And so now if we wanted to call this method on the class, then all we would do is we would say person.printName, and calling that method on the actual person, because this is an instance of the person class, by calling this method, we would then see this.name being printed out, which is dude. And of course, we could also make this an ES6 function by using the arrow key and just saying that print name equals to this, this method being called. So we could also do that like that. And then the last thing about classes is the concept of inheritance. And so inheritance is when classes extend from another class. So for example, let's say we had a class of human, and human just contains one field which we'll just say is the species. And so in our case, we'll say that the species is human, and we intuitively know that a person is a human. So that means that we could say that the person extends from human. And what that means is that the person is a new class, although it is gaining the same features of that of the human. So basically what that means is that if we wanted to access the species field on the person, we could do that because the person is being referenced as a direct, as inheriting the properties of this class. So here, to access that species, we could say console.log person.species, and then this would print out human. So now we're going to look at the spread and rest operators. And so they actually use the same syntax, which is just 3 dots. And yes, that seems very strange, but that actually is all it is. So to illustrate it, let's say we had some array. So we'll say constant array equals to, and it just has a few variables. So we'll just say 1, 2, 3. And let's say we wanted to get the values of that array. Well, what we can do is we can say the new array equals to, and then we can pull all the values of this object by saying dot 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 array. And so what that does, using the spread operator, it's creating a shallow clone of this instance, this array here. So in essence, what that's done is it's given us access to the 1, 2, and 3. And it's not creating an extra list. It's not copying the list itself. It's actually copying the elements themselves. And so that is quite convenient because we've created a very nice copy of that object. And so we've basically pulled out the properties of it. So then we could add onto this list by saying 4, 5. And now the list would become 4, 5. In another example, let's say we have some kind of object. So we'll just say the object equals to something like that. And we'll give it a name and just say dude. And so if we wanted to copy this object, then we would do it in the exact same way. So we'll say the new object equals to, and then we just say dot 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 object. And so again, that grabs the name field of this object. And then we can specify more fields. So like, let's say the age is 25 and etc, etc. So the new object essentially would then be like this. It would have the name field, which would be dude, and then it would have the age of 25. So that's what this new object would be. And so this is quite useful because we're creating or cloning these arrays and objects, and so they're both reference types. So we're actually copying them quite safely, and that's been quite a tricky thing originally, and especially since we're working with React and the state that was shown in some previous videos, working with the state is quite tricky because you don't want to mutate it or mutate the original state. But by using the spread operator, you can now safely mutate it by creating a shallow clone of it. The last ES6 feature we're going to look at is destructuring. And so destructuring allows you to easily access the values of arrays or objects and assign them to variables quite conveniently. So for example, let's say you have an array, so array, and it's equal to 1, 2, 3, just like that. And so if you wanted to get the value 1, then normally we would have to call array and then get the first element, so calling bracket 0 to get the first element. But now what you could do is you could say constant and then create a list and say a comma b equals to array. And this is called destructuring. So basically what's happening is that this list, the values a and b are being basically assigned the values of 1 and 2 inside the array. So if we were to print it out, then we would get, let's say if we were to say console.log a, then we would get 1, and if we were to log out b, then we would get 2. So that is an example of destructuring an array. For example, let's say we look at an object now. So let's say we have constant object, and that's just something that has, for example, name, and we'll say Matt, and age. And then let's say we wanted to access the name property of the object. Well, normally we'd have to say object.name, but instead what you can do now is you can say constant name, and we're placing it inside these curly braces, so creating that variable. And it's basically a shortcut method for saying equal to the object. So you don't even have to call object.name. This, so saying name equals object.name, is the same thing, these two. So this is just a shortcut method of doing that. And so let's say we wanted to combine this into a function. So we'll say constant show name equals to something that takes in a person object, and using ES6 arrow functions we can say that it logs out the person object.name. But now this is forcing us to basically take in the whole object just so that we can access the name, whereas now using destructuring we can then remove the need to pass in the object and actually achieve the same thing. So we could say show name better equals to taking that person object, rather taking in the person name, and that person name we can reference the same way we did like this. So we'll just say name like that and say it equals to, and now the arrow function is going to shout at us, so we actually have to put this inside parentheses just like that, and then we can say console.log name. So now we can pass in the object, but we don't need to call the actual .name of it. So for example, we could say show name better of, and then pass in an object here and make sure that it has the name field and say name equals something and age equals to whatever. So this is just an example of destructuring and actually using it in an arrow function.